All right, well, kids, let's get started. Put this over here. Cool. All right. So we left off talking about the storming of the Bastille, which is that giant medieval castle dungeon building that got torn down in the middle of the, or at the beginning rather, of the French Revolution. It's the first violent act of revolution. And as you can see in this image here, all these guys lined up with pikes, and there's cannons, and there's some people who have fallen there. And the Bastille was a reminder, a symbolic reminder of the ancient regime, that first, second, third estate society that France lived under for so long, and that they've recently overthrown. Remember that the third estate, when they met at the estate's general meeting, they decided to throw off the title of third estate and begin calling themselves the National Assembly after an inspired speech by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a priest from the First Estate, who had actually come to the Third Estate Chamber Hall where they were meeting at the Estates General, and gave a speech about love of liberty and the importance of the Third Estate in making laws for the people of France, because his argument was that the Third Estate is the people of France, that they were everything. And so we are now moving into kind of the next little part of the French Revolution here. We are still in the Age of Montesquieu, as we are nicknaming it for our class. The Age of Montesquieu represented by a time early in the French Revolution where the revolutionary goals were relatively moderate. Remember that they're simply in the early days of the French Revolution trying to established France as a constitutional monarchy, the same as Britain. So it's not super radical yet, even though we're seeing the storming of the Bastille and stuff like that happen. The most radical phase of the French Revolution is still yet to come. We're not quite there yet. We're still in the early years. And the next major thing that we're going to talk about is the Great Fear of 1789, shortly after the storming of the Bastille, which remember happens July 14th, 1789, just 10 days after the 4th of July. The Great Fear of 1789 starts in about August and kind of, spreads over time. And the Great Fear was where the revolutionary fervor from Paris, where the storming of the Bastille happened, started to spread to the countryside. And peasants, peasants are typically pretty conservative, but whenever there's kind of disorder and stuff like that, peasants can get a little bit hot and bothered, and you get peasant revolts. And so the peasants started attacking manor houses of their feudal lords, right? The nobles' lands who they lived on. And they started attacking manor houses to destroy legal records of their feudal obligations. They kind of see an opportunity here to perhaps improve their own lot in life. Middle-class owners also had a tendency to attack, and or to be attacked, rather. The middle-class owners were also attacked, not just the nobles. And recent enclosures that had been built in France were undone. The enclosure movement that happened in Britain was much slower to take place in France. So that's why it says recent enclosures, because just in the recent years before the start of the French Revolution, French nobles had begun building enclosures very similar to how the British were doing. And old common lands start to be reoccupied, forests get seized, so they start hunting, taxes go unpaid, and this is what was known as the Great Fear. It's kind of this senseless panic that spreads across the peasantry in the countryside in France about 2 or 3 weeks after the storming of the Bastille. By August 4th of 1789, feudalism was abolished by the National Assembly, previously known as the Third Estate, right? And so the National Assembly, I just want to remind you, the National Assembly was always meant to be a temporary lawmaking body. The National Assembly was, from its inception, when they first voted to throw off the title of Third Estate and start calling themselves, the delegates of the Third Estate at the Estates General start calling themselves the National Assembly, they never intended to hold power forever. They were only doing it until they could come up with a blueprint for government, a constitution. And so they are starting to make laws, but this is going to be a provisional government, what they call a provisional government, a temporary government, until they come up with a satisfactory permanent solution, rather, to the government. And it's going to take them a couple years to do that. But the National Assembly was, from its design, meant to be short-lived, just as a heads up. And this abolishing of the of feudalism, getting rid of the ancient regime, first, second, third estate titles, and the declaration of equality of taxation for all classes. This constituted one of the two great social changes of the revolution, the other one being the abolition of the guild system, which had been used. The guild system, remember, was like a craftsman. The guilds were these craftsman organizations where, particularly in urban areas, guilds had a whole lot of power over production. But they were kind of a relic of the mercantilist age, and so they get thrown out as well. And they ended serfdom where it still existed, which was not many places in France. There was very, very little serfdom left in France, but wherever it existed in France, they got rid of it. They also ended exclusive hunting rights for nobles. They ended fees for justice. They ended village monopolies. They ended the corvée and various other feudal dues that they had been forced to pay for so many years. The other major piece of legislation or document that gets drafted by the National Assembly that's very significant in the early part of the French Revolution is known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this became the constitutional blueprint for France. They're not quite there yet, but they're beginning to draft what is essentially kind of a Bill of Rights sort of thing. It's almost a blend between the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence in a way. Once again, this piece of legislation, or this document, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, is very heavily draws upon the teachings of the Enlightenment, where in it they talk about Enlightenment philosophy, classical liberalism, things like, a quote from it is that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Remember that during this time, due to prevailing attitudes surrounding gender roles and attitudes about the sexes between men and women, the thing that is unfortunate that we have to just kind of understand about documents like this that come from the late 1700s, remember that they're still living in a very patriarchal time, and that women are more or less excluded from voting rights and equal participation in society. There were very distinct ideas surrounding, at this time, what was appropriate for women to do in terms of work, roles that women played, and versus what men did. And that really a lot of those prevailing gender norms or attitudes lasted a really long time. It's not really until quite recently that we've become, in the West, very, very comfortable with women serving as politicians, women serving in capacities as lawyers and doctors and professors and researchers and so on. It just wasn't very common in these times for women to hold those kinds of positions. Fortunately, though, we've progressed, and now we have a lot more open, liberal attitudes about how women ought to participate in society in all aspects of society. But when they wrote this line, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights," they pretty much are pretty well exclusively referring to men. Although women did receive equal legal rights as men, they when I say legal, I mean like in terms of judicial, like representation rights. But in practice, we have to understand that just because you write something down in a law doesn't mean that it necessarily changes attitudes overnight. And even from the Enlightenment philosophers, many of them felt that women, women weren't necessarily, particularly appropriate for, being students of the Enlightenment. It was very sexist at that time. And so anyhow, but they do start to grant things like freedom of expression and religion. They also wrote that taxes could only be raised with the common consent, very similar to Britain, right? The Magna Carta had been the document that ensured that the king could not just arbitrarily raise taxes on the nobles back in 1215 in England. And then, of course, that was further solidified with the English Bill of Rights in 1689. But now we're in 1789, and the French finally have drafted a similar kind of document. Also, all public servants were going to be accountable for their conduct in office. This was an attempt to crack down on corruption. Separation of powers through separate branches. That's a Montesquieu idea from the Enlightenment. Confiscation of private property from persons had to be done with fair compensation. So if the government took your land or took your private possessions, you had to be compensated. And the term citizen applied to all French people. They started looking at French society as being much more of a national orientation. People, one of the major changes of the French Revolution is kind of a swift turn towards nationalism. And we should just briefly have a conversation about the significance of nationalism, as it's going to continue to come up throughout the rest of the class as a major theme. How is nationalism different than feudalism? Well, when we think about how France was before, how sovereignty of France, independence of the country of France was determined, sovereignty rested with a monarch, okay? And France was very much a kingdom, an absolute monarchy, right? And in those times, in the ancient regime times, first, second, third estate times, people weren't really considered citizens. They were considered subjects of the king. And so when you think about that, there's a big difference between citizenship, where you are loyal to the state, okay? You're loyal to the state, you're loyal to the nationality, the nation, the group of people. And when we say nation, we're talking about the people. Remember that nation describes a people, not a place, okay? Nation state describes a place, but nation describes a people. And so when we say citizen, we're saying all French people belong equally to the state, okay? They are not subjects of a king, and their rights are not derived from what is bestowed by the king. Their rights are derived from their natural rights of life, liberty, property. And citizenship, when you go to another place and they ask you what's your nationality, you don't go and say, well, I'm a humble and loyal servant of our president, Donald Trump. Okay, that would be foolish. You would say, I'm an American citizen, meaning your loyalty and your identity rests with the nation, not with being a subject of a monarch or a tyrant or a ruler of some sort. Okay, and that's really a big change, right? That's how America had set up their government as well, where people were citizens of the United States, and rather than subjects of a royal figure. So that's the big difference. And as I said, we're going to see a lot more nationality or nationalism throughout the rest of the class. And really it's solidified increasingly by Napoleon when he comes to power later on. Here's just this is in French, so you won't be able to read it, but this is kind of a visual depiction of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The unity of the National Assembly, where at first kind of everybody was on the same page in the National Assembly. They were all members of the Third Estate. They were all delegates at the estate's general meeting when they start to call themselves the National Assembly. But that unity began to unravel regarding how much power the monarch, King Louis XVI, should retain. Remember that they are trying to create a constitutional monarchy, and they're trying to do this through a democratic process. And we have to be honest about democracy as a system of government. There is a famous quote from Winston Churchill, and if you've never heard of Winston Churchill before, he was the Prime Minister of Britain during World War II in the 1940s, okay, early 1940s. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, once famously said, democracy is, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing here, this isn't a word for word quote, but democracy is the worst form of government. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others that have been tried. Meaning that, and when you think about what this quote means, it's kind of it's a tongue-in-cheek sort of a jokingly type of quote. It's a little bit sarcastic or whatever, facetious, where he's basically saying, you know, democracy is the worst form of government except for all those others that have been tried. What he's saying basically is that, you know, democracy isn't easy. Democracy's difficult. We have to be honest about democracy. Democracy is a pain in the rear end sometimes. Why? Because in a democracy, all voices are heard. And when you have a lot of opinions and a lot of ideas and a lot of, different visions of the future of what you want to accomplish in the country, you know, democracy is a real difficult way to go about exacting change, because you have to compromise. Okay, a democracy is riddled with conflict, and you argue and you vote again and you argue more and you compromise, and ultimately good democracy rests on two sides of an issue coming together, sacrificing on either side certain things that they want for the overall kind of general good or general will, Rousseau, of the people, right? And but it, you know, it's riddled with conflict, and it's not easy. And so these legislators in the National Assembly begin to have disagreements about the extent to which Louis XVI should retain, monarchical authority. Some people are a little bit more conservative. They want to see the king retain more power. Some people are more radical. They want to see the king's power stripped from him. And so these are the kinds of conversations that begin to happen that kind of unravel this initial spirit of unity that the National Assembly had. And also, the rights of women are very interesting during the French Revolution. Now, women do gain increased rights to divorce. They gain increased rights to inherit property. As I said, legally, women do tend to advance a little bit in the French Revolution, but socially we need to understand that women still are more or less relegated to kind of second-class citizens by comparison to men in the French state, and it remains that way for quite some time. Keep in mind that France, in terms of giving the right to vote to women, doesn't award the right to vote officially, permanently, to women. There is a period of time where women are allowed to vote, but it's taken away from them, I believe, at some point in the revolution. But generally speaking, women are not given the right to vote in France until after World War II, which is really pretty late for Western Europe. Women had been given the right to vote in Britain after World War I, about 25 years earlier. And women had been given the right to vote in America about the same time. So France was actually a little late in giving women the permanent ability to vote. Although, like I said, I do believe, if I'm not misremembering, I believe there was a period of time, a short period of time, at some point in the revolution where women did have the ability to vote, but then somehow, because France keeps on going back to the drawing board and the governments keep on getting dissolved and reinstated with new ones, I think that goes away relatively quickly. I'm not 100%, I would have to double check on that one, but something in my mind sticks out, as I feel like there was a period of, just a very temporary period of time where women had the ability to vote, and then it was stripped away, and they don't get it back until World War II. But don't quote me on that one. I'm gonna have to go back and double check that. But anyhow, Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen did not give women equal rights across the board in society. They had limited, better legal rights, but women could not vote or hold office. The existing system gave males the advantage in family law, property rights, and education. And at this point, you have to understand again, just very few people believed in gender equality at this time. There were just very deeply entrenched ideas about proper roles of men and women in society at this time. Among the leaders of the revolution, Jean de Condorcet was the only one who really argued for gender equality, and he was considered quite radical for his time. That's not to say, though, that there weren't some important women contributing to philosophical ideas both in and outside of France at this time. Olympe de Gouges is probably one of the most well-known women philosophers of the Enlightenment. She actually took the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and rewrote the entire thing and named it the Rights of Women in 1791, 2 years after. And she took each of the 17 articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and applied each of them to women's rights, asserted the right to divorce under certain conditions, to control property in marriage, to have equal access to higher education, to be able to hold civilian careers and public employment positions. These are the kinds of things that Olympe de Gouges advocated for as far back as 1791. Now, of course, we have to understand the effects of this were relatively limited, but it just goes to show you that there were women at this time who were thinking about the roles of women and expanding women's participation both in public and in private life. Mary Wollstonecraft was a similar woman who in Britain, she is an English woman. In Britain, she wrote a piece a year after Olympe de Gouges, who she was heavily influenced by, where she defended de Gouges' ideas and wrote a piece of her own known as the Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. And also there is Madame de Stael. Madame de Stael ran a salon, and she wrote widely read books in her time and was an educated middle upper class woman, and she opposed the subordination of women that the revolution was doing so little to change at that time. And we have to also mention that women played a very important role in the early phase of the French Revolution. And the important role that I'm referring to is here on the next slide. It happened on October 5th, 1789. There were some working class women in Paris. There's a river that runs through Paris called the Seine, S-E-I-N-E, the River Seine, and that runs through Paris. And the Seine River had a number of docks, and the Seine was used for, of course, trade and fishing and other things like that. And there were these women, these dock worker women, who were used to they was kind of burly working class women who worked at the docks, not peasant, but urban working women. And women in this time were the ones who went to the marketplace to purchase food for their families. And these women, these dock worker women who were kind of used to carting these heavy crates around, kind of burly, strong women, became furious over how little the revolution had done to help the food crisis, the economic crisis that was going on. Remember that political revolutions, from a political sense, they can be rather fast acting. We're talking about just a period of a couple of months here between the storming of the Bastille in July 14th, 1789 and October 5th, 1789. That's only about 4 or 5 months. That's relatively quick in terms of the political upheaval that we're seeing. But when it comes to economies are kind of like those giant ocean barges that you see. Once they're heading in a certain direction, it takes a long time and a lot of energy to slow down a barge and then turn it around, right? It's just a massive, massive thing that once it's already heading in a certain direction, the momentum that keeps pushing it in that direction means it's going to take a lot more time to turn the economic situation around. So the political situation is fast acting, but even if they act quickly, unfortunately, just because you pass laws and do things like that, it doesn't necessarily translate to having a fast effect on the economy. And this was frustrating to particularly the hungry and relatively more vulnerable working class segments of the French population, the peasants and urban workers, of which these women dock workers were a part. And so these women, after becoming increasingly frustrated and angry about these exorbitant costs of bread that they needed to survive and keep their families fed, pushed them to the point of full-blown revolution themselves. And what these women do, after being incited by this kind of local newspaper malcontent known as Jean-Paul Marat, okay, Jean-Paul Marat was kind of a, to be honest, kind of a loser of sorts. He was a kind of a nobody prior to the start of the revolution, but sometimes, you know, political upheaval and social upheaval opens the door for loud-mouthed, you know, visionaries to have a voice. And Jean-Paul Marat was one of these guys. He was to be honest with you, he had been, at the start of the revolution, he was actually living in the sewers of Paris. He had acquired this terrible skin condition. I think it was like a fungal condition of his skin that required him to be sitting in Epsom salt baths for much of his day. And he was really kind of this angry, hot-headed sort of a guy. And he got a voice with this newspaper that he was publishing at the time called The People's Friend, which is a really funny name for his paper, considering that his paper directly led to the executions of countless people in the height of the French Revolution. And Jean-Paul Marat, early in the days of the French Revolution, in his writing of his paper, was very much stoking the flames of the political upheaval in France at this time. And so 7,000 women, inspired by the writings of Marat, as well as you know, by their discontent of the bread prices, march from Paris all the way out to Versailles. That's a 12-mile march, with the intention specifically of slaughtering Marie Antoinette, the queen, who, Marie Antoinette, remember, because of her very ostentatious lifestyle, where she was spending just exorbitant amounts of money, and the fact that she was Austrian and so out of touch with society and what was going on in France at this time, she very much became the target, perhaps unfairly, of the French population. Specifically, though, these angry, these fearsome fish ladies, these dock workers, who marched out to Versailles with the intention of beheading Marie Antoinette. And indeed, they get to the Palace of Versailles, they storm the palace, they slaughter the bodyguards once again, just like with the storming of the Bastille, cutting off their heads and putting them on pikes, as they break into the Palace of Versailles and end up absolutely destroying the place, searching the entire palace. And I think, didn't we, and you guys can tell me in the chat, Didn't I, when we were first talking about the building of the Palace of Versailles and the absolutism unit, didn't I take you on a virtual tour of Versailles and show you kind of the inside and how big Versailles was? Didn't I do that? I feel like I did. Okay, cool. So you guys might remember then what the inside of the palace looks like. You might remember the Hall of Mirrors, for example, and things like that. And they break into it and they start tearing the place up. Now, they can't find Queen Marie Antoinette. She's nowhere to be found. And remember, Versailles is a huge place anyway, so it would have been really hard to find somebody there anyway. But they can't find her, and they end up going to her bedchambers and tearing her mattress apart instead. Now, by this point, you have to understand they've marched 12 miles to Versailles. They've stormed the place. They've cut a few people's heads off. They've torn the place up. They've ripped apart her mattress, and they can't find her. They're pretty tired by this point. Eventually, they do find the king and queen, but by the time that they find her, tempers have cooled, and probably they're pretty exhausted. And so instead of murdering the king and queen, they instead arrest the king and queen, and they force the king and queen to come back to Paris. They permanently remove the king and queen from the Palace of Versailles. And by the way, it's the last time that the king and queen would be at Versailles, is after this women's march to Versailles, where the women were really very much responsible for removing the king and queen from the palace and relocating them during the midst of the revolution back to Paris. And here is an image of the fearsome fish ladies who marched with their pikes and spears and various other weapons, halberds, cannons, all the way out to Versailles. And here they are marching back, and it says, "We have the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy." And of course, they're referring to Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and their son, of course, named Louis. And so the entire royal family is moved back to Tuileries Palace, which was the royal residence located in the heart of Paris. Now, once again, if you plan to take a trip to Paris and visit Tuileries Palace, unfortunately, you're going to be out of luck. This time, though, not because it was torn down in the Revolution, but Tuileries Palace actually survived the French Revolution and several decades afterwards. However, in the I want to say the 1860s, maybe somewhere in that area, 1880s, sometime in the 19th century, Tuileries Palace burns down. There's a fire in Tuileries Palace, and the whole palace is completely unsalvageable, and it is torn down afterwards. And so there is no Tuileries Palace there anymore. If you were interested in where it used to be, very, very close to the Louvre Museum. If you ever go to Paris and you go to the Louvre, which is the famous art museum where the Mona Lisa is located, the Tuileries Palace used to be located basically on the same block as the Louvre Museum right in central Paris. And so that's where it was. But anyhow, the National Assembly also was moved to Paris at this time and intimidated by the Parisians, in particular a group of quite feisty Parisians known as the sans-culottes, who we will talk about in a different class. But I believe that I have exhausted my time for today. So, folks, I will be putting up a new reading guide assignment for you guys to do over the weekend, just so that we stay on pace with what we need to do. I'm really trying to I'm basically stripping the class down to the bare essentials. You may find that we have less work this semester. It's just because I need to move through stuff, and I don't want to be overloading you with work that makes you feel like you can't keep up with what goes on, because we have a certain pace that we need to make. But just to let you know, it's pretty much going to be bare bones in terms of like our class structure. I'm going to be just lecturing and doing reading guides and some online quizzes when we get to doing the end of the unit sort of review stuff. And yes, will we be assigned with weekend homework? Yeah, but only similar stuff to what you would do during the week. It's just going to be more reading guide questions for this weekend at least. And that I mean, as long as you can just keep on top of those reading guide discussion questions as we move throughout the unit, hopefully you'll be in good shape. It's just a matter of getting them done consistently and getting into a pattern over it. But I'm going to try and make it so that we can just kind of cruise through material as quickly as we can, so that we can move forward here. Good. Yeah, Lourdes, I'm happy to hear that. It's been a hard year for a lot of folks. To be honest, I've never assigned less work in Euro. I tried to start off by kind of assigning the same things that I would if we were in class. But if we were in class, you'd have more time to work on things. There would be group work. There'd be other things like that we would do. But it's just really, really hard in an online setting to be able to do those same kinds of assignments. So basically, we're just going to kind of stick with the bare bones and move our way through and try and get done with all content by the time that we get to the AP exam. So it's basically going to be questions every day, but it'll only be questions every day and then lecture every day. So and then some practice DBQs here and there. All right, folks. Well, that's it for me today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful 3-day weekend, and we'll see you back on Tuesday morning. Have a great day.